On the quiet streets of Allenton, Derby, a tragic fire consumed a family home in the early hours of May 11, 2012. As the flames swallowed the lives of 6 children, their parents, Mick and Mairead Philpot, emerged from the wreckage, faces etched with grief. The nation watched, horrified as they made public pleas for answers, their pain seemingly impossible to fake. But as investigators sifted through the ashes, what they found would change everything. At one point, postmen, the fire wasn't an accident, and the truth behind those tearful appeals was far more shocking than anyone could have imagined. What kind of parent could engineer such devastation? And why? Today, we unravel the harrowing story of the Derby family, a case that exposed a web of manipulation, deceit, and a chilling pursuit of greed, leaving an entire community shattered. This is the story of Mick and Mairead Philpot, a couple who became household names in the UK, but not for reasons anyone could have predicted. Mick Philpot, known for his controversial lifestyle and controlling personality, lived in a crowded home with his wife, his mistress Lisa Willis, and their combined 17 children. But by 2012, the household was unraveling. Lisa Willis, seeking freedom from Mick's domineering grip, fled with her children, leaving Mick reeling in a desperate attempt to regain control and custody. Mick concocted a plan so reckless and cruel that its consequences would stun the world. On May 11, 2012, a fire ripped through the Philpot home, killing 6 of their children, Dwayne, Jade, John, Jack, Jesse, and Jaden. While their parents wept before the cameras, calling for justice, investigators slowly uncovered the horrific truth. This was no accident, but an arson attack orchestrated by Mick and Mairead themselves. Their plan to frame Lisa Willis had gone tragically, fatally wrong. This is not just a story of crime. It is a story of manipulation, greed, and the unimaginable cost of a father's hubris. To understand the events that led to one of Britain's most disturbing crimes, we must begin with Mick Philpot's early years. Born in 1956 in Derby, England, Mick grew up in a working-class family, surrounded by a culture where discipline often blurred into violence. Accounts from those who knew him paint a picture of a boy who struggled to fit in, angry, resentful, and often lashing out. It wasn't long before those traits took root, transforming into something far darker. By his teenage years, Philpot's temper had become notorious. He dropped out of school early, finding himself in and out of trouble with the law. His relationships with women, even in those formative years, were marked by control and aggression. At just 19 years old, Mick's violent tendencies escalated when he attacked a girlfriend who attempted to leave him. The brutal assault left her hospitalized with life-altering injuries. For this, Mick served time in prison, a punishment many would argue failed to reform him. As he entered adulthood, Philpot developed a pattern of manipulating those around him, particularly women. Friends and neighbors later recounted how Mick seemed to thrive on domination, ensuring his partners were isolated and dependent. This control wasn't limited to emotional manipulation. Philpot's violence became a tool to enforce his will. It was these early years of unchecked aggression, combined with a complete lack of accountability, that shaped Mick Philpot into the man who would later orchestrate a crime so horrific it stunned the nation. But what set the stage for the tragedy to come wasn't just his behavior. It was the system and circumstances that allowed him to remain unchecked for so long. Long before the tragic fire that would shock the nation, Mick Philpot had already carved a dark path through the lives of those who dared to get close to him. In the late 1970s, a young Mick, then only 21 years old, was involved in an act of violence so brutal it left permanent scars, not only on his victim, but on his reputation. His girlfriend at the time, Kim Hill, had decided to end their relationship, a decision Philpot could not accept. Overcome with rage, he launched a ferocious attack, stabbing her more than a dozen times. Her screams echoed through the neighborhood as she desperately tried to escape, but Philpot wasn't finished. He followed her into the street and, in front of witnesses, stabbed her further before turning the blade on her mother when she tried to intervene. Miraculously, both Kim Hill and her mother survived the attack, but the trauma was permanent. Philpot, however, showed no remorse. He was convicted of attempted murder and served only 3 years of a 7-year sentence, a punishment many felt was far too lenient for such a savage act. Even after his release, the violence didn't stop. Philpot's control and intimidation became a pattern in his relationships, setting the stage for the manipulative and destructive behavior that would ultimately culminate in tragedy decades later. To understand the depths of what unfolded, we need to step into the complex and unconventional world Mick Philpot created within his home. Mick, known for his domineering personality, lived a life that was far from ordinary. Under one roof in Derby, he shared a home with his wife Mairead and his mistress Lisa Willis. Between them, they had 17 children, 11 of whom lived in the house full-time. What may have appeared to some as a chaotic but functional arrangement was, in reality, a household governed by control, manipulation, and fear. Mairead, Mick's wife, was 31 when the fire took place. She was quiet and reserved, often overshadowed by her husband's larger-than-life personality. Those who knew her described her as deeply submissive, someone who seemed to exist in Mick's shadow. Despite this, she played a pivotal role in keeping the household running, tending to the children and maintaining the appearance of a family, all while Mick exercised near-total control over every aspect of her life. Then there was Lisa Willis, the 28-year-old mistress, who had lived in the Philpot household for over a decade. Lisa bore 5 of Mick's children and worked tirelessly as a caregiver within the home. Her relationship with Mick was less about love and more about dependency and control. Witnesses would later recount how Lisa, like Mairead, was subjected to Mick's intimidating demeanor and relentless need to assert authority. Mick kept both women financially and emotionally tethered to him, creating a dynamic where neither could easily leave. And then there were the children. To the outside world, the Philpot home seemed alive with the chaos and noise of a bustling large family. But behind closed doors, Mick's household ran like a dictatorship. He would pit the 2 women against each other, sowing tension while maintaining himself as the dominant figure. Friends of the family would later say that Mick treated his children less as individuals and more as a means to an end, a way to perpetuate his influence and collect substantial welfare benefits. This house of cards began to collapse when, in February 2012, Lisa Willis decided she had had enough. Quietly, she packed her belongings, gathered her children, and left Mick behind. She didn't just leave the household, she shattered the delicate balance Mick had spent years constructing. Lisa's departure wasn't merely an emotional blow for Mick. It was a direct threat to his control, his lifestyle, and most importantly, his financial stability. With Lisa gone, Mick's grip on his carefully curated world began to slip. And it was this loss of control, this perceived betrayal, that became the spark for what was to come. Mick's response to Lisa's departure wasn't reconciliation, nor was it acceptance. Instead, he began plotting an act so devastating it would cost the lives of 6 of his own children. For years, Lisa Willis lived in the shadow of Mick Philpot, a man who ruled his household with an iron fist. Sharing a home with Mick, his wife Mairead, and their children, Lisa was both a mistress and a caretaker, raising her own children alongside Mick's growing brood. But behind closed doors, life with Mick was far from ordinary or peaceful. His controlling nature seeped into every corner of their lives, dictating where they went, who they spoke to, and how they lived. By early 2012, cracks in this unusual arrangement had become impossible to ignore. Mick's jealousy and obsession with dominance escalated, often leading to heated arguments that Lisa could no longer endure. Her decision to leave wasn't just about escaping a toxic environment. It was about protecting her children from a man who seemed to see them as tools in his pursuit of power and financial gain. One day, while Mick was out of the house, Lisa packed her belongings and, without a word, left with her children. It was a quiet act of defiance against years of control, but it was also one that would ignite a chain of events no one could have predicted. For Mick Philpot, Lisa's departure wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was a direct threat to his way of life. The loss of Lisa's children also meant a significant reduction in the welfare benefits he relied on to sustain his growing empire. Anger turned to obsession as Mick began plotting a way to bring Lisa back, or destroy her entirely. It was a desperate man's gambit, and the cost would be paid in lives. Mick Philpot was no stranger to controversy. Known in his community for his volatile temper and controlling nature, Mick had long built his life around manipulating those closest to him. Living in a crowded council house with his wife, Mairead, his mistress, Lisa Willis, and their combined 11 children, Mick relied heavily on government benefits to sustain his unconventional household. Each child brought additional financial support, and in Mick's eyes, they weren't just children, they were assets. But by February 2012, cracks began to appear in Mick's carefully controlled world. Lisa Willis, fed up with years of abuse and control, made a bold move. She left Mick, taking her 5 children with her. For Mick, this wasn't just a blow to his ego, it was a direct threat to his financial security. Losing Lisa's children meant losing a significant portion of the benefits that Mick relied upon to maintain his lifestyle. Fans will never forget on March 31, 1995, when everyone noticed a man in railbow cowboy clothes unearthed, and, perhaps even more damaging, Lisa's departure challenged the dominance he had meticulously exerted over his family for years. What followed was a desperate and calculated plan. Mick decided he would regain custody of Lisa's children at any cost, and he knew exactly how to do it. He hatched a scheme so audacious, so dangerous, that it defied belief. He would set fire to his own home, make it appear as though Lisa was responsible, and emerge as the heroic father who narrowly escaped tragedy. The plan was as reckless as it was cruel. For Mick, it wasn't just about getting the children back. It was about winning, about proving that no one could defy him and walk away unscathed. Mairead, his loyal and subservient wife, became an accomplice. Together, they recruited Paul Mosley, a family friend, to help carry out the plan. Mick was confident in his ability to control the narrative, to manipulate the police, the media, and anyone else who dared to question him. But as the night of May 11 approached, the stage was set for a tragedy that would not only expose Mick's dark ambition, but devastate an entire community forever. It was a calm spring night in Derby, May 11, 2012. Inside the Philpot family home, 6 children were fast asleep in their beds. The house on Victory Road, a modest council property, was filled with the quiet sounds of children dreaming, unaware of the chaos that was about to erupt. Mick Philpot, the patriarch of the family, stood outside, accompanied by his wife Mairead and their friend Paul Mosley. Their plan was simple but diabolical. Ignite a fire to frame Mick's ex-mistress, Lisa Willis, for arson, hoping to regain custody of her children and maintain the steady flow of welfare benefits they relied upon. The chosen weapon was petrol, a single can poured with deliberate precision. As the clock crept past midnight, the flammable liquid was carefully funneled through the letterbox at the front door. The fumes lingered for moments, their deadly potential waiting to be unleashed. Then came the spark. A match was struck, and the fire roared to life almost instantly. Flames hungrily consumed the hallways, climbing the staircase like a predator. The children, asleep upstairs, were trapped before they could even realize what was happening. The smoke thickened, seeping under doors and filling rooms with a suffocating darkness. Neighbors would later describe the sound of crackling wood and distant cries for help. But by then, it was already too late. The blaze was too fierce, the house becoming a furnace within minutes. As the fire raged, Mick and Mairead stood outside, waiting for the inevitable chaos to unfold. But the scene quickly spiraled out of their control. Mick's plan to break in and heroically rescue the children, a staged attempt to frame Lisa, was impossible. The heat and smoke were impenetrable. There was no going back. Frantic neighbors arrived, desperately trying to help. They smashed windows, shouting for the children trapped inside. Firefighters arrived on the scene within minutes, their sirens piercing the night. But even their efforts could not match the inferno's speed. When the fire was finally subdued, the reality of what had happened became painfully clear. 6 young lives, Dwayne, Jade, John, Jack, Jesse, and Jaden, had perished in their beds, unable to escape the smoke and flames. The Philpots' home was reduced to a hollowed-out shell, the walls now charred and silent, bearing the weight of an unspeakable tragedy. As paramedics worked tirelessly to revive the victims, the Philpots' grief took center stage. Mick collapsed in apparent anguish, clutching his wife as the world watched their mourning unfold. But behind the tears, questions lingered. Why had Mick, a man who so often basked in the limelight, failed to save his children? And how did the fire spread so quickly? Investigators would soon uncover that this wasn't a tragedy born from an accident. This was a calculated crime, one where the cost of greed and control was paid in the lives of 6 innocent children. As the fire raged through Victory Road, the piercing sound of breaking glass and frantic screams shattered the quiet of the early morning. It was just after 4 a.m. when the first neighbors noticed the glow of the flames illuminating the street. Chaos erupted as residents scrambled out of their homes, their faces painted with shock and horror. Smoke billowed into the sky, thick and suffocating, making it nearly impossible to see what lay beyond the orange inferno. Neighbors rushed to help, pounding on doors, shouting the names of the children they knew were inside. One man, clutching a garden hose, tried desperately to douse the flames, while others threw bricks at the windows, hoping to create an escape route. But the heat was unbearable, forcing even the most determined back. "It's too late," someone murmured in disbelief, but no one wanted to believe it. Emergency services arrived within minutes, but to those gathered on the street, it felt like a lifetime. Firefighters broke through the front door, battling through the choking smoke and intense heat to reach the children. Paramedics stood ready with stretchers and oxygen tanks, hoping for a miracle. One by one, the firefighters emerged, cradling lifeless bodies in their arms, their own faces masked by years of training, but their eyes betraying the weight of what they had just witnessed. The community watched in silence, the enormity of the tragedy sinking in. Grown men wept openly, mothers clutched their own children tightly, unable to look away but wishing they could unsee. "Why them?" a voice whispered from the crowd, a question that no one could answer. In those harrowing moments, Victory Road was not just a street, but the epicenter of unspeakable grief. A row of terraced houses, once filled with the chatter and laughter of children, now stood eerily quiet, marked forever by the heavy scent of smoke and loss. As investigators combed through the charred remains of 18 Victory Road, their first question was not one of criminal intent, but survival. How could a fire so destructive leave 2 adults unharmed while 6 children perished? It was a tragedy, undoubtedly, but was there more to it than met the eye? Early in the investigation, neighbors began to raise subtle, troubling questions. Why hadn't Mick Philpot tried to enter the house to save his children, even as others risked their lives to help? His cries for justice, heartfelt as they seemed, didn't match his behavior during the chaos of that fateful night. Witness accounts began to paint a picture that felt off. The fire itself told a story too. Fire experts quickly ruled out an accidental blaze. The flames had originated near the front door, where traces of petrol, a clear accelerant, were discovered. Forensics confirmed it. This was no accident. This was arson. But the Philpots maintained their innocence, even holding a public press conference just days after the fire. With Mick's arm tightly around Mairead, they wept as they begged for help finding the perpetrator. To many watching, their grief seemed genuine, raw. But to seasoned detectives, something wasn't right. The emotions appeared rehearsed, exaggerated. In private interviews, their accounts lacked cohesion, with Mick often steering the narrative in ways that raised suspicion. And then there were his choices after the fire, staying in a hotel with Mairead rather than at a family member's home, and discussing the tragedy in ways that made investigators take notice. Determined to dig deeper, the police decided to monitor the grieving parents more closely. Their hotel room was secretly bugged, and it was here that the veneer of grief began to crack. In their private conversations, Mick and Mairead spoke not about their children, but about themselves, about the media coverage, their public image, and what might happen next. On one recorded clip, Mick was heard instructing Mairead on what to say to the authorities. "Stick to the story," he reminded her. "It wasn't a slip, it was a revelation." Other evidence began to pile up. Forensics linked petrol traces found on Mick and Mairead's clothing to the accelerant used at the scene. Surveillance footage from a nearby petrol station confirmed that a can of fuel had been purchased just days before the fire. And then there was the motive: money. Mick's long history of manipulating the welfare system to support his lavish, polyamorous lifestyle came into sharp focus. His plan, investigators believed, was to frame his ex-mistress, Lisa Willis, for the arson, win custody of her children, and secure the benefits that came with them. Piece by piece, the evidence painted a chilling picture of premeditated destruction. On May 29, 2012, just weeks after the fire, Mick and Mairead Philpot were arrested on suspicion of murder. For a community still reeling from the loss of 6 innocent lives, the revelation was a second, equally devastating blow. The grieving parents were now suspects in a crime so heinous It defied understanding. As the investigation into the tragic fire intensified, police found themselves piecing together a puzzle where every detail mattered. While the Philpots publicly portrayed themselves as devastated parents, inconsistencies in their behavior raised suspicions. Mick Philpot's odd composure during interviews and Mairead's detached demeanor hinted at something deeper. Investigators needed more than speculation. They needed hard evidence. That's when they made a pivotal decision. They placed hidden recording devices in the hotel room where Mick and Mairead were staying after the fire. In the privacy of that room, the grieving facade began to crack. Conversations captured on tape painted a chilling picture. Mick was heard coaching Mairead on what to say to the media and speculating about what investigators might uncover. At one point, Mick even scolded Mairead for not being convincing enough in her emotional displays during their public appeals. But it wasn't just the words. They revealed actions, too. The recordings picked up discussions about what went wrong with the plan. Mick and Mairead openly talked about the petrol and the fire, inadvertently exposing their knowledge of critical details only the arsonist would know. This surveillance operation became the cornerstone of the case, the irrefutable evidence that tore through their web of lies and brought their true motives into the light. For the detectives, it wasn't just about catching the culprits. It was about seeking justice for 6 young lives lost in unimaginable circumstances. And it was these recordings, captured when the Philpots thought no one was listening, that provided the key to unlocking the truth. The trial of Mick and Mairead Philpot, along with their accomplice Paul Mosley, began in February 2013 at Nottingham Crown Court. The prosecution, led by Richard Latham QC, painted a damning picture of Mick Philpot as the architect of a reckless plan, driven by greed and an obsessive need to control those around him. At the heart of the case was the devastating allegation that Mick had deliberately set the fire to frame his ex-mistress, Lisa Willis, in a bitter custody battle over her children. This, prosecutors argued, was all part of a scheme to continue receiving thousands of pounds in child benefits. The court heard from forensic experts who testified that traces of petrol had been found in the hallway of the Philpot home, confirming that the fire had been deliberately started. A key piece of evidence came from bugged recordings of Mick and Mairead at a hotel after the fire, where they were unknowingly under surveillance. On those tapes, Mick was heard coaching Mairead on what to say to investigators, even expressing frustration over how their story was being perceived. Witness testimonies further unraveled Mick's image as a grieving father. Neighbors described his unusual behavior on the night of the fire, noting that he appeared calm and oddly detached as firefighters battled the flames. The prosecution argued that Mick's outward grief was nothing more than a performance, part of his carefully crafted narrative to manipulate public sympathy. For her part, Mairead claimed she was a victim of Mick's domineering control. Through her defense team, she portrayed herself as a woman trapped in an abusive relationship, too scared to oppose her husband's plans. Paul Mosley, the third defendant, insisted he had no active role in starting the fire, though the prosecution contended he was complicit, fully aware of Mick's intentions. Perhaps the most heart-wrenching moment of the trial came when jurors were shown photos of the 6 children who lost their lives: Duane, Jade, John, Jack, Jesse, and Jaden. The weight of their loss hung heavy in the courtroom, underscoring the sheer magnitude of the crime. In April 2013, after weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned their verdict. Mick and Mairead Philpot were found guilty of the manslaughter of their 6 children, as was Paul Mosley. Sentencing came swiftly, with Mick receiving a life sentence with a minimum term of 15 years. Mairead and Mosley were each sentenced to 17 years in prison, their culpability deemed significant but overshadowed by Mick's role as the mastermind. The courtroom fell silent as the judge delivered his final remarks, condemning Mick Philpot as a manipulative man whose actions had resulted in an unimaginable tragedy. The verdict brought some closure, but for the families and community affected, the scars of that fateful night in Derby would never truly heal. The trial of Mick and Mairead Philpot, along with their accomplice Paul Mosley, began in February 2013 at Nottingham Crown Court. Over 6 weeks, the jury was presented with evidence that painted a devastating picture of the events leading up to the fire. Forensic experts testified to the use of petrol as an accelerant, and the prosecution played damning recordings from a police surveillance device hidden in the Philpot's hotel room. These conversations revealed a shocking level of indifference and even amusement as Mick and Mairead discussed their alibis, unaware they were being monitored. Mick Philpot, described by the prosecution as a controlling and manipulative man, took the stand in his defense, claiming the fire was a terrible accident, but his attempts to shift blame faltered under cross-examination. Mairead Philpot, who had stood by her husband throughout the trial, echoed his version of events, but her demeanor in court only deepened suspicions of her complicity. On April 2, 2013, the jury returned their verdict. Mick and Mairead Philpot, along with Paul Mosley, were found guilty of the manslaughter of the 6 children. The prosecution had argued that while the fire may not have been intended to kill, the reckless disregard for the lives of those inside the house made them responsible for the deaths. Mick Philpot was sentenced to life imprisonment, with the judge ordering that he serve a minimum of 15 years before being eligible for parole. In delivering the sentence, the judge described Mick as a disturbingly dangerous man whose actions were motivated by a selfish and vindictive desire for revenge and financial gain. Mairead Philpot, though cast in a slightly less dominant role, was also condemned for her part in the crime. She and Paul Mosley were each sentenced to 17 years in prison, with the judge emphasizing their shared culpability and failure to act to protect the children. As the sentences were handed down, there was no sign of remorse from Mick Philpot. Instead, his stoic expression seemed to confirm the chilling detachment investigators had seen throughout the case. Mairead wept quietly, but the courtroom, filled with family members of the victims, erupted in subdued sobs and murmurs. For the community of Derby, the trial's conclusion brought some measure of justice, but the shadow of the Philpots' actions would linger far longer. The public reaction to the Derby family tragedy was one of profound shock and anger. In the days following the fire, a wave of grief rippled through the local community. Vigils were held, flowers and toys were left outside the Philpot home, and neighbors spoke of the children with warmth and affection. 6 young lives full of promise had been lost in what appeared to be an unfathomable tragedy. But as the investigation progressed, and the truth about Mick and Mairead Philpot's involvement came to light, public sentiment turned to outrage. The parents who had once stood before television cameras as symbols of loss and despair were now seen as cold and manipulative, willing to sacrifice their own children for personal gain. The media coverage was relentless. Mick Philpot, already known to the public from his appearances on talk shows, where he proudly discussed his unconventional lifestyle, became a lightning rod for criticism. Tabloid headlines branded him as a monster, while news outlets dissected every detail of his controlling and narcissistic behavior. Mairead, once seen as a grieving mother, was now painted as a complicit accomplice, raising difficult questions about the dynamics of power and control within their relationship. The case ignited a broader debate across the UK. Many questioned how the welfare system could be manipulated to support a man like Mick Philpot, who used his children as pawns in a dangerous game of greed. Politicians weighed in, with some using the tragedy as a platform to call for welfare reform. Others warned against allowing the actions of one family to stigmatize those in genuine need. But perhaps the most haunting reaction came from those closest to the Philpot children: their schoolmates, teachers, and neighbors. In interviews and statements, they spoke of a family that seemed chaotic but loving, never imagining the horrors unfolding behind closed doors. For them, the revelation of the parents' guilt was a betrayal that cut deeply. As the court delivered its verdicts and the sentences were handed down, there was a sense of justice served, but it was cold comfort. The convictions worked for generations and the sentences were handed down. There was a sense of justice served, but it was cold comfort. For many, the Philpot case was not just about the loss of 6 innocent children, but a stark reminder of how far human cruelty can go, and the devastating cost of unchecked manipulation and control. Today, over a decade after the devastating fire that claimed the lives of 6 innocent children, the individuals responsible for this horrifying crime have faced the consequences of their actions. But the echoes of that night still linger. Mick Philpot remains in prison, serving a life sentence with a minimum term of 15 years. Now in his mid-60s, he has repeatedly made headlines for his alleged behavior behind bars. Reports suggest that he shows little remorse for his actions, maintaining a manipulative demeanor that mirrors the control he wielded over his family. Mick will be eligible for parole in 2028, but questions remain about whether he could ever re-enter society after such a heinous crime. Mairead Philpot, once portrayed as a grieving mother, served half of her 17-year sentence and was released on license in November 2020. Her release was met with public outrage, as many believed her punishment was insufficient for her role in the deaths of her children. Now in her early 40s, Mairead is reportedly living under a new identity in a protected location, far from the public eye. Her attempt to rebuild her life remains clouded by the weight of her involvement in the crime. Paul Mosley, the third accomplice in this tragedy, was also sentenced to 17 years for manslaughter. Like Mairead, he served half his sentence and was released in 2023. Details of his current life are scarce, but his release reignited public anger, with many questioning whether justice was truly served. For the families and loved ones of the victims, no amount of time can erase the pain of losing 6 bright young lives. The tragedy has left an indelible mark on the Derby community, a reminder of the devastating consequences of greed, control, and manipulation. As the world moves on, the question remains, how do we reconcile the freedom of those responsible with the irreversible loss they caused? Justice may have been served in the courtroom, but the scars of this crime will endure for generations. The Derby Family Massacre is a story that forces us to confront some of the darkest aspects of human behavior: manipulation, control, and the devastating consequences of unchecked greed. But beyond the courtroom sentences and the headlines, it's the lives of 6 innocent children that remain at the heart of this tragedy. Dwayne, Jade, John, Jack, Jesse, and Jaden didn't have a choice. They were born into a world where the very people meant to protect them became their greatest danger. This case reminds us of the fragility of trust and the essential role that society must play in safeguarding vulnerable lives. It sheds light on the critical importance of child welfare systems, not just as a safety net, but as a means of recognizing and addressing warning signs before it's too late. Could intervention have saved these children? That question lingers, haunting us, urging us to do better. At its core, this story challenges us to think about our responsibilities, not just as individuals, but as a community, to ensure that no child's cries for help go unheard. It is a call to action for vigilance, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to protect the most innocent among us. Because in the end, their safety is not just a moral obligation, it is the measure of our humanity. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you think the justice system delivered a fair sentence, or should the penalties have been harsher? How do you feel about the debate surrounding the welfare system and its role in this tragedy? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. And if stories like this captivate you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into the world of true crime.